Nu är det dags för den tredje och sista delen av dagens program. Och det här kommer hållas på engelska. So I will switch to English. So this last part will be about sustainable logistics. And we have a very prominent guest and a very prominent discussant for this section that I will try to make justice by introducing them. The first one is Professor Alan McKinnon. I think many of you know his name from before. He has done research in freight. He's done research for 40 years in freight transportation and logistics, and the last 15 years related to climate change. Hello, Alan. Hello. And I would dare to say that you're not only famous for people in Sweden or Europe, but also worldwide. You have worked a lot globally. And you will have a presentation for us. And then I also would like to present your discussant, which is Professor Michael Browne. Hello, Mike. And he is actually working here in Gothenburg as a professor of sustainable urban freight at in Gothenburg University. And the two of you, I know you're both from the UK, you know each other from before, and you will, after Alan has been presenting, having a discussion that we are really looking forward to. And also after that, I will take care of some of the questions in the chat. So please pose questions during Alan's presentation or during Mike's and Alan's discussion, and maybe we can ask some of those questions at the end.
Great, thanks.
Good to hear your voice, Mike. Alan?
Okay, well, I begin in that case. Well, thank you for inviting me to speak at this event. The theme of my talk is going to be net zero logistics. Can I just check that this is going to work?
Please try to point on the PowerPoint, and then I think you should be able to use the arrows on the keyboard. Perfect. Thank you.
Yes, they do. That's great. Thank you very much for that. Yeah, great. Okay. Okay, so I've packed a lot into this presentation, so I'll minimize the amount of preamble. When I talk about climate change and logistics, I always like to begin by updating people on the climate science. Now, we've had a brutal reminder in recent months of the scale of the challenge that faces us here. We've obviously seen extreme weather events in the west coast of North America, flooding in Germany, the wildfires in Greece. We've had the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change publish its 6th assessment report, which, as the media has reported, is the starkest warning yet of the magnitude of the climate change problem, insisting that we have to stay within a 1.5 degree temperature increase by 2100. We're already 1.2 degrees above the 1850 figure, so we don't have much time left to do that. The big worry, of course, is that we cross climatic tipping points from which there is no return. And a lot of recent research has suggested that these tipping points may be interconnected, and in which case there would be a cascading of those effects. We now have to reduce our emissions dramatically to achieve that. This is to stay within 1.5 degree temperature increase. If we had started cutting our emissions back in 2000, 20 years ago, we could have had a much more gradual decline. Now such as the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, we now need an almost precipitous reduction, and that is going to be extremely difficult to achieve. The estimation is that our carbon budgets for 1.5 degree temperature increase will be exhausted within only 8 years, in which case we're going to have to rely very heavily on the sequestration, on the removal of greenhouse gases already in the atmosphere. So what does this mean? I mean, the term net zero trips off the tongue very lightly. We hear politicians, managers, even academics referring frequently to this expression, but do we really know what it means? I mean, it's not absolute or gross zero. We've passed the opportunity really to ever achieve that. So Dieter Helm, professor at Oxford University, published a really good book on net zero last year. And he said, net zero means that natural and industrial sequestration must be equal to or greater than the remaining carbon emissions. Now, many countries are now committed to being net zero. So according to the UN's Race to Zero, 120 countries, over 3,000 businesses are now committed to do this. But that, as I say, will entail removing a lot of greenhouse gas already in the atmosphere. The Intergovernmental Panel of Climate and Climate Change suggests that by 2050, we may have to be absorbing up to 8 gigatons, 8 billion tons of CO2 per annum from the atmosphere. Now, put that into perspective, that's 23 times as much CO2 as Britain emitted in 2019. How do we do that? Well, we deploy what we call these negative emission technologies. We'll be using carbon capture and storage, linking that to what we call bioenergy, where we will grow biomass, we will burn that to get the energy, and then capture and bury the CO2. Also, we can use reforestation to help that process. And there's direct air capture, where we use devices called carbon scrubbers to remove the CO2. But there's a lot of concern currently in the climate change community about our reliance on net zero. Really interesting blog published in the Conversation website a few months ago from climate scientists, where they said within a few decades, we will need to transform our civilization from one that currently pumps 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere each year to one that produces a net removal of tens of billions. And that is going to be a very dramatic transformation. They also say net zero has licensed a recklessly cavalier burn now, pay later approach, which has seen our emissions continue to soar. The danger is we're just passing responsibility to future generations to remove from the atmosphere a lot of the CO2 that we're currently putting up there. Let's then bring this to transport and logistics. So how does net zero relate to freight transport? So the International Transport Forum earlier this year published its latest assessment report, and they are predicting that the application of current policies worldwide will see the total amount of freight movement worldwide increase by about 22% by 2050. They look at various scenarios. Their most optimistic, ambitious, carbon-friendly scenario, they call Reshape Plus, would see a 72% reduction in freight emissions by 2050 against a 2015 base year. But still not getting us down to zero. There would still be a large amount of residual CO2 emission from freight. The Green Deal, the EU's sustainable and smart mobility strategy, anticipates only about a 90% reduction in CO2 emissions from transport. That's passenger and freight by 1990. So there'll be a remaining amount of CO2 that will have to be cancelled in some way. And so what I'm arguing is, even with the most radical policy initiatives in place, it's likely that we will have to remove some of the CO2 put into the atmosphere by freight transport. And that will be expensive. There have been 2 reports published recently in the UK looking at the relative costs of removing CO2 from the atmosphere with the costs of, for example, electrifying cars and vans, or introducing low carbon electricity, or even developing low carbon fuels for the shipping sector. So it would be much cheaper for us to mitigate than it would be for us to put the CO2 into the atmosphere and then have to remove it. So let's look at logistics. I published a book on decarbonizing logistics back in 2018 and pulled together what data I could find on the subject. And if you carbon footprint logistics worldwide, it represents between 10 and 11% of energy-related CO2 emissions, with most of that coming from freight transport. Perceived as a very hard sector to decarbonize, partly because of its very heavy dependence on fossil fuel, but also because of the high forecast growth in freight movement. ITF project a 2.6 times increase in number of ton kilometers worldwide between 2015 and 2050. How do we then reduce those emissions? Well, I'd like to begin by looking at what I call the mitigation side of net zero. How do we cut the emissions? Now, I think it's now recognized there are 5 categories of initiative that we can deploy. We can just try to reduce the amount of freight movement. We can then shift as much freight as possible to lower carbon transport modes. We can fill the vehicles, the vessels, the aircraft better. We can utilize the capacity better. We can increase the energy efficiency of freight transport. And then we can reduce the carbon content of the energy we use in the freight sector. And this is sort of my adaptation of the much used avoid, shift, improve framework. So let's look at each of these options in turn. First of all, reducing the total amount of freight movement. Now, one thing we could do is reverse the processes, many of them supply chain processes, that have driven the growth of freight movement in the past, right? So we could reverse globalization, we could reshore production and sourcing, we could decentralize production and inventory, but as logistics specialists, I'm sure you're aware that is going to be very difficult and would come with a very high carbon mitigation cost. There are various other processes that will help, which will reduce the amount of stuff that has to be moved, move to a share economy or a circular economy, or designing products with less material. We already have seen pronounced miniaturization, for example, and lightweighting in the electronics sector, for example. We can digitize more physical products. It's happened already with entertainment media and educational media, but we could just convert more consignments into electrons. And we can also use 3D printing. I mean, the feeling is that that will help to streamline supply chains and may, in the longer term, help to cut ton kilometers. Another thing that will help is the phase out of fossil fuels. Last year, it was estimated that about a third of all freight movement worldwide is of coal, oil, and gas. So as we phase out these, the use of these fuels, that will reduce the amount of freight demand. But, and it's a big but, there will be other sectors which will increase the demand for freight. So we're having to put into place a renewable energy infrastructure, moving wind turbines and solar panels. That's requiring a lot of freight movement. There's a huge growth in the demand for air conditioning currently around the world. We're going to have to adapt our built environment to climate change, and that will involve the movement of a lot of materials. And there are 220 million people in the world living within 5 meters of sea level. We're going to have to resettle that population, and that construction will generate a lot of freight movement. And I'll say more about this later, we have to look at the logistical activity associated with negative emissions, with removing emissions from the atmosphere. Second category of measures is moving freight to lower carbon, transport carbon modes. For good reason. We can see how the carbon intensity of freight modes varies enormously. We did a survey of 92 executives, logistics executives in Europe recently about decarbonization. And one question we asked them was what they thought the most cost-effective way would be of decarbonizing logistics. And right at the top there is shift to cleaner transport modes. So I think there's a recognition in industry that it will now make sense to shift as much freight to rail and waterborne transport. But there are problems. This will involve reversing a long-term decline in the railway share of the freight market. And there are very few countries in the world that have been able to achieve this. The other problem is that fossil fuel has been a core traffic of railways around the world. And the railways will find it very difficult, it seems to me, to replace that heavy, dense coal and oil with other products. But also the carbon intensity differences between road and rail are narrowing. So maybe the case for modal shift will reduce through time. But the one big advantage the railways have is their direct connection to low carbon electricity. About half of the freight moved by rail in the world is hauled by electric locomotives. And there are other things which are quite positive. The efforts in Europe and in Southeast Asia, for example, to develop intermodal corridors seem to be working to get more companies to use rail, but also innovations like synchromodal scheduling, which again offers a means to try to get more freight onto these lower carbon transport modes. My third category of measure relates to the optimization of capacity utilization in the freight sector, can yield large carbon savings, relatively low or even negative carbon mitigation costs, and can be done quickly. And you know, for climate science reasons, we have to act urgently. Now, as I'm sure you're well aware, a lot of kilometers run empty. A lot of laden vehicles are underloaded, or in the case of the developing world, they're overloaded, and the overloading of the vehicles can carry just as heavy a carbon penalty. So why don't we fill the vehicles better? Well, myself and Mike and others have done a lot of research on what is constraining capacity utilization in this sector. And as you can see, there are a whole range of things. I mean, companies are not just being careless, but I mean, they're often being perfectly rational in underutilizing their capacity. But there are a number of things which will hopefully allow us to fill the vehicles, the vessels, the aircraft better. Logistical collaboration will help. There's a recognition that for us to achieve deep reductions in CO2 emissions from logistics, companies will have to share their logistics assets to a much greater extent than they currently do. Digitalization, I think, is going to be transformational here, with the growth of online procurement, application of AI and machine learning in vehicle routing, for example. Relaxation of truck size and weight, I think, will help. Now, I know in Sweden, you've had a long history of using longer and heavier vehicles, but I think we have to see similar application of high capacity transport elsewhere in the world to cut carbon. And then we may have to do even more radical things like relax just in time. I know that many logistics managers would consider that currently to be heresy, but it may be necessary in a low carbon world. Moving to the fourth category of initiative, improving energy efficiency. We can take a long-term perspective on that would allow us to develop a lot of new technologies in terms of the design and operation of vehicles. We could maybe see the uptake of tuning and vehicle automation. And you know, there are fuel economy standards being applied around the world. According to the International Energy Agency, about 70% of trucks in the world are now sold in countries with fuel economy standards. We obviously have them in place in Europe. And also in the maritime sector, I mean, we've had a fuel economy standard for new ships since 2014. And that is helping to drive greater fuel efficiency. But there are things we can do in the short term. We can obviously retrofit fuel-saving devices. We can operate the vehicles better. And I think there's general recognition that training drivers to drive trucks more fuel efficiently is one of the most cost-effective ways of decarbonizing logistics. And we can improve maintenance. We can change business practice. I've been a long-term advocate of the deceleration of freight transport, which we have seen in the maritime sector with the application of slow steaming. But there are also some big logistics companies now which are reducing the maximum vehicle speed on the governors of the vehicles. And it's been shown that that doesn't severely adverse the service quality. So it is actually a relatively cost-effective way of decarbonizing logistics. And then the fifth category of measure is switching to lower carbon forms of energy. There are lots of options for all the different freight transport modes, as you can see on that table. Unfortunately, there's a lot of uncertainty currently as to which ones will dominate. A lot of disagreement on this. There's a lot of lobbying for particular fuels, particularly hydrogen. And the other problem is the long lifespan of the vehicles in this sector, particularly in the aviation and maritime sector. So if we have to change the vehicle to adopt these alternative fuels, that's going to be a long-term process. And also, a lot of these alternative energies require new energy infrastructures. And the problem is going to be coordinating the development of this transport technology, the development of the energy infrastructure, the manufacture of the new vehicles, and also the uptake of this, because often freight operators have a rather long replacement cycle, and that is going to be tough, even over a period of a few decades. The other problem we will have is ensuring that the freight and logistics sector can get access to adequate quantities of these alternative low carbon fuels. And related to that is the decarbonization of electricity, because I think the main way we're going to decarbonize freight transport and logistics is through applying low carbon electricity. Now, in Europe, as you can see, the projection is we're going to see the carbon intensity of electricity drop quite sharply. You are very lucky in Sweden because you currently have one of the lowest carbon intensities in Europe, but other countries have to follow your example. But if we take a global perspective on this, there are a lot of countries in the world where currently, including China, for example, where the carbon intensity is very high and it's not dropping very steeply. So what are the options? Well, if we look at just road freight, I think it's going to be batteries that will help us to electrify local deliveries, urban logistics, for example. The cost of the batteries drastically reducing, big increase in the recharging networks. Long distance trucking is going to be more of a problem. I think we've seen quite dramatic improvements in battery performance recently, and the batteries used in trucks have been getting lighter. If one looks at recent research by the Berkeley Institute in California, for example, suggesting that the weight penalty of the latest generation of electric trucks will not be all that severe, and also we can recharge those trucks more rapidly now than we previously thought. Will there be a role for hydrogen for longer hauls? I think so, and also possibly as a range extender for battery vehicles. But I'm a bit of a hydrogen skeptic because hydrogen is currently a fossil fuel made with natural gas. It's only when we have enough green hydrogen made with from electrolyzation of water using low carbon electricity that we can do this. But in that process, we waste a lot of energy. As much as 70% of the low carbon electricity is lost as we move from the original source to the wheel of the vehicle. And of course, we mustn't forget the electrification of highways as well. I know that Sweden has shown great interest in this, and I know you've got trials operating, as indeed there are trials in Germany and in the US. Again, it's a very energy efficient way of getting low carbon electricity into the trucking industry. But there's a capital cost associated with it. There'll be a challenge in coordinating the development of infrastructure with the uptake of a new generation of trolley vehicles. So anyway, that's a very quick summary of the mitigation side of net zero. Let's now move on to look at the sequestration side of net zero and ask, to what extent can that sequestration activity be applied at either a corporate or a sectoral level? Now, many companies are now signing up for what we call science-based targeting. And if you look at the Science-Based Targeting Initiative worldwide, it insists that companies have to cut emissions within their organization. They cannot rely on carbon offsetting, right? And I imagine that same principle may apply to sequestration further down the line, but that is not as yet resolved. But what would be the opportunities for carbon removal within the logistics sector? Well, one thing we could do is put carbon capture and storage on mobile assets, on trucks and on ships, so that there is a lot of research currently underway, much of it funded by Aramco, for example, on having carbon capture and storage on vehicles. And this would obviously capture the CO2 produced in the vehicle. It would then be stored, and when the vehicle arrived back at its depot, the CO2 would be removed and then disposed of. And also in the maritime sector, there's a new project just starting in Norway looking at the application of carbon capture and storage on ships. DNV, the Norwegian certification agency, has estimated in the longer term that as much as 50% of the reduction in maritime emissions may come from onboard carbon capture and storage. But the other thing is that logistics is going to be fundamental to carbon sequestration. From all these activities, afforestation, using carbon scrubbing, the BECCS process. And I would like to think that maybe logistics would qualify for negative emission credits for being so fundamental to that process of removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. I think in the longer term, however, there will still be a need for carbon offsetting and what they call carbon insetting, which is where carbon offsetting occurs within a particular sector, like logistics. But the key thing is we will need to minimize the carbon intensity of negative emission logistics. Interesting report published just 2 weeks ago in the UK on what we call the engineered removal of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, looking at how we have to minimize the emissions of CO2 in the process of sequestration. And they've got 2 examples there of a low carbon sequestration process and a high carbon sequestration process. And in the high carbon transportation process, it's because a lot of CO2 would be emitted from the collection and transportation of the biomass. Now, also, I draw your attention to a really interesting paper just published, again, a couple of weeks ago by researchers here in the UK they have developed a model, they call it their carbon navigation system, which aims to minimize the CO2 emissions from the BECCS process, right? So what it does is it models the amount of CO2 from the growing and collection of the biomass, its transportation, to the carbon capture and storage process, to then the movement of the liquid CO2 to the points where it's buried under the ground. And so a lot of interesting work is being done at the moment to see how we can decarbonize, if you like, this carbon sequestration process. But if we take a global perspective on this, this is a journal paper I found from 2009. So the researchers in this case did a lot of forward thinking, and they reckoned that sometime in the future, we would have to use sequestration. And the process that they look at is what is called the Green Beaches proposal, where you use a rock called olivine, which is very good at absorbing CO2 from the atmosphere. It works best where this process occurs in humid tropical climates. So we would have to mine the ore, it's called dunite, and then transport that into the tropical world, where it would be crushed, put on the beaches would turn green, and it would absorb CO2. So they said, you know, how much of this rock would we have to move to cancel out 1 year of CO2 emissions? And that was back in 2009. It would be 7 cubic kilometers of rock. That's about twice the quantity that's currently mined of coal, currently mined globally. But they then said, how would we transport that? And they looked at the transport implications. They reckon we'd have to transport about 5 billion tons of this rock a year. That's 100 million truckloads, 200,000 shiploads. And the conclusion they came to at that time was that we just did not have the transport capacity worldwide to move that amount of olivine to cancel out the emissions. They reckon we could only maybe manage about 5 to 10% of that. This is a study that really needs to be updated using the current carbon data and sequestration data and transport data as well. But it illustrates how people are now seriously thinking about the subject. Anyway, just to conclude, it seems to me in the future that logistics businesses will fall into 3 categories. There will be those companies which will be carbon negative, you know, where there will be a net reduction in greenhouse gases, which will result either from the carbon sequestration credits that I mentioned, or because they produce a surplus of renewable energy. For example, the warehouse there in the picture is one in Tilburg in the Netherlands, whose roof is covered with 13,000 solar panels, and it produces enough renewable energy, not just to power the warehouse, but to power about 750 houses in the surrounding area. So those are carbon negative. And then there's carbon neutrality. There'll be some logistics operations which will be carbon neutral, where you've achieved complete decarbonization, and I think rail freight operations will permit that, local deliveries by battery-powered vans, and also possibly if we have mobile carbon capture and storage, as I've described, that again may give you carbon neutrality. But a lot of operations will still be carbon positive, where there will be residual CO2 emissions will go into the atmosphere. And these will come from the so-called hard-to-abate sectors like air cargo, maritime operations, perhaps some long-distance trucking. And there'll be a need there for some offsetting, which can either be externalized, it can be cross-sectoral, or it can be carbon insetting, where that offsetting is done within the logistics sector. And I'm sorry I got through this so quickly. This is my concluding slide. The BBC recently reported that because of climate change, there will be dry, hot summers in Scotland. Now, my home is in Edinburgh here. So roll on climate change. Just please forget everything I've just told you about net emissions. And on that point, I will stop. Those are my contact details. And I always plug my book on decarbonizing logistics. And happy to take any questions you now have for me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Alan. That was a great presentation, very rich, lots of detail. And I think now we get the chance to discuss this for a short time, and then we'll have some questions and answers from the audience. So maybe you can change the screen, so at least that's it. I think that's better. Okay, so very good. And I mean, some of that material you've compiled over a lot of years, as you said, and you've been working in this field for a long time. And it's great to hear the way you bring it together and make such an interesting picture of it. You crammed an awful lot into the 30 minutes, 25 minutes. I guess if you had a luxury of all afternoon, what would you really sort of tell us? What would you have focused on much more? What bits did you go very fast on? And what should we really sort of look more deeply at?
Yeah. I think on the mitigation side, I mean, I often give presentations that just look at the mitigation aspects of decarbonisation, so I can drill down into those subjects in a lot more detail. I suppose the presentation was also a bit skewed towards road freight. So it's also worth, I think, investigating the problems of decarbonising shipping operations or air cargo in particular. So I think I'd have spent a bit more time on these alternative modes as well. And there isn't too much more to be said about the sequestration side at the moment, because there isn't a lot written on the subject. There's still a lot of research. So, I mean, any junior academics in the audience looking for a very fertile area for future research, look at the logistics of negative emissions.
Yeah,
because it seems to me a lot of basic work is still to be done there.
A lot of things still to do on that score. I mean, having said that, there's not a lot of information. I mean, in some ways, that was a very data-rich presentation, which I know that you enjoyed using the data and so on. And the data made me think a little bit about this when I saw what you were going to talk about. And data's good. It provides an argument. You mentioned words like evidence-based policy initiatives, evidence-based action by companies. But how reliable is some of the data? Do you sort of sometimes find yourself waking in the middle of the night and thinking, oh, golly, that chart is great, but what about the way they measured utilization? Or so do you think the reliability is improving? Are we tough enough on this data?
Yeah, great question, Mike. I think it is improving through time. I suppose, like many others, I'm guilty often of accepting data at face value. If you think the organization or the researchers producing it are reputable and have a good track record, you tend to accept it. Now, a lot of the global data here comes from the International Transport Forum, which is part of the OECD. I mean, we eagerly await their outlook reports coming out in a 2-yearly cycle. And I mean, their modeling, I think, has become more sophisticated through time. But if you compare their carbon estimates from 2019 with those of 2021, you'll see that there have been significant changes. So they reckon the growth of ton kilometers worldwide won't be growing at 3.1 times as they thought 2 years ago. It's now 2.6, and they reckon that there are things been happening which have been dampening the demand. So it's one of the problems we have, and I mean, I think all academics have, is in understanding the methodology that's been used to compile some of the statistics. And I'm often critical of consultants' reports here, because there's a lot of consultancy work being done on decarbonizing supply chains and so forth. And they produce nice glossy reports with great numbers, but they very seldom explain to you what their data sources were and how they did the modeling. And that is something that concerns me.
Yeah. I suppose you started the presentation with this slide, which really shows that sort of it's a bit like that advice about how to get somewhere, where people say, well, if I were you, I wouldn't start from here, because the speed at which that has to take place is rather daunting. So I can see in that sense that talking about 2050 is very convenient, because it's sort of sounds like it's a date that you can imagine, but it's far enough away that whoever's talking about it in politics now almost certainly won't, well, not every country, but almost certainly won't be in power in 2050. And so it's a kind of kicking the can down the road tactic to some extent. And does that worry you a bit, that it's, we get this date 2050, because it's sort of sounds good and so on, and then we start focusing on 2050, and in the meantime we're really not actually getting on with some of these actions, because you have plenty of actions that we could regulate for some of these things, we could price for some of them, but we talk about 2050.
No, it does greatly concern me. We've got the COP26 conference coming up in Scotland, just 40 miles down the road from where I am at the moment. And much of the focus there is going to be on net zero and a 2050 time horizon. Although, thankfully, recently there's been more discussion about 2030, because the latest IPCC report that came out said, don't fixate on 2050. We really have to act very quickly, and it's But you're right. I mean, politicians have a limited shelf life. Not just politicians, also logistics managers.
Yeah.
Because my worry is if we are preoccupied with these very long-term perspectives, logistics managers say, well, this is for the future generations. This is for my successor to deal with. And it feels that it then lets them off the hook. And yeah, I mean, we need this sense of urgency. There's a slide that I also use in presentations in this area, where I look at what we have to do in the freight transport area,
Yes.
even just to meet the 2030 targets.
Yeah.
And that is going to be extremely challenging. So it's changing the mindsets of all the stakeholders and decision makers to make them feel we can't just leave this to future generations. We got to deal with it now.
Yeah, and also realizing that these things are all joined up, because as you point out, the replacement cycle of things is very varied, and they're not neatly matched with each other, even though they're all part of the same system. So when you start thinking about which things you can change, there are some you can change now, but the argument to change other things will be much slower to be developed, I guess.
Exactly, that's true.
Just sticking on this thing about change and the actions required, one worry that I have when I think about this, and I listen to presentations, and including this one worry I have is that we're presenting a lot of complex information and trying to make it understandable. And when you're dealing with people who are responsible for making these kind of political decisions, it seems like there's a very small level of interest in anything that's very complicated. So telling people that something's complicated is not greeted with enthusiasm. And there's this desperate search always for the solution, or fairly simple, narrow set of solutions. Do you think we could, I mean, is there some way we could, and if we don't engage with those decision makers, then things won't get changed, and I don't think so quickly. So is there something that we as researchers could do to simplify this a bit? Because I mean, it seems to me that it's like there's so many things we could do that people say, oh, well, they just don't know where to start.
No, it's a good point. I think a lot of the communication in climate change generally has not been effective because people have not tailored the message to particular audiences. So a presentation like the one I gave today, I suppose I targeted more at academics, consultants, the people who are interested more in the analytical aspects of the subject. I think if I had done one which was focused on politicians or civil servants, I might have changed it in some way to make some of the messages and the options a bit clearer. As well. But the other stakeholder group we haven't spoken about are the consumers.
The end users. I can come to that.
Because the other issue is, I always get a bit concerned when I talk about the climate science early on, that it comes across too negatively and people think it's too late. There's nothing we can do, and they switch off. So it's got to be sufficiently upbeat so that you say to people, okay, it's going to be an emergency, it's going to be serious, and we've got to act quickly. But there are things that we can do manageably within a certain time frame, so you keep them positive and engaged. And that is difficult. So I think the answer is partly to tailor presentation or the communication to the particular audience that you're dealing with. And as you say, to focus on some of the key bullet points. But I think we have to get away from any sense that there's a silver bullet here. I mean, I think everything we do, it's going to be a whole range of things that we have to combine really to achieve the desired effect.
No, and I think, you mentioned about consumers, and I was thinking about that when you were presenting, because you talked about just in time, and, now we have so-called instant deliveries where seems to me to be carefully designed for people who can't make a list. But anyway, so that I'm having a barbecue with some friends, well, maybe I should buy some wine or beer or whatever it is. But anyway, that's another point. But if we think about the consumer side of it, you mentioned about, in a sense, about less stuff being moved around. So that implies, different kind of consumption patterns. But that has consequences as well, because, it's the consumption of things are jobs for people and so on. And I think this is very concerning at the political level. But I think it's difficult to sort of know how to start with the change in behavior for consumers, isn't it, to some extent? And the logistics system is is one of the problems seems to be it's treated as a very invisible part of the system until COVID came along. But
yes.
The relationship of the consumer to the logistics system is very strong, obviously.
Yeah, no, that's very true. We have to face the fact that a lot of consumption currently is unsustainable.
Yeah.
You know, our obsession with fashion and buying clothing and wearing it twice and chucking it out. I mean, we just cannot continue doing that. So that we have to reform the way in which we buy and consume things, there's no question. Yeah. In the case of logistics, I think part of the problem is that logistics has been so good that it's been abused. You know, the fact that we can provide instant delivery and people then think they can order in the morning and have it delivered in the afternoon. I mean, if people then get conditioned to expect that type of, and give no thought at all to all the extra energy and emissions associated with that speed of delivery, that is very worrying, it seems to me. And hopefully that will change. But I'm also, we're just talking about consumers in general. If we take a sort of more demographic view on this, I think the younger generation are becoming very aware of the climate problem that we now face. And I think many of them are linking that to their own lifestyles and to their pattern of consumption. And I think that's reassuring. It may be the older generation like us, Mike, that take a bit longer to adapt. But the other thing is the price mechanism at the end. I think once we put a price on carbon, probably quite a high price, and it's reflected in the price of goods. That, in the end, I think is going to reshape consumer behaviour and make it more happen.
And that implies there's some quite big decisions to be made. And I was thinking back to being in the project with you in 2006, the Green Logistics Project in the UK. And I remember the things that used to come from some of the workshops in that session, which I still see it around in a sense. And that's all about so many things being a win-win. And so I remember having discussions about fuel consumption with transport operators. And of course, you know, to save fuel was a win-win and nobody would waste fuel if they could avoid it. But maybe we have to go beyond these sort of rather easy to say win-win things. I mean, maybe somebody does have to, as you say, price carbon at a realistic level, which has a lot of uncomfortable consequences. Or maybe we actually should regulate some of these things, even though that's very tricky to handle in terms of market economies. And there's no particular, it's not obvious there's a direction that we're going in that direction at all, I don't think.
No.
So, you know, when you look back to say 2006, because that's 15 years ago, and it's not quite as far as you were looking ahead, but it's you know, it's halfway to looking ahead. Do you think that some of these research things? Do you think some of the research projects missed the point a bit? Was it useful? Is it bound to be a long time to get there? Because some of what's being said now is quite like what was being said then. So what has been the main change between, say, the beginning of the Green Logistics Project and what you presented today? What would you say was sort of a big change that you've thought about over that time? So it's a hard question to answer.
It's a hard question to answer. I mean, one thing that's happened over those 15 years is we've put an awful lot more greenhouse gas into the atmosphere. We've exhausted a lot more of our 1.5 degree budget. And also back then we were thinking in terms of, you know, it'd be okay if there was a 2 degree increase in temperature or 2.5. You know, we've had to recalibrate all of that in the light of the climate science. So that's one dramatic thing that's happened. I think, you know, that the logistics has become greener over that time period. You know, the things that we researched and discussed back then, I mean, many of those things have been implemented. In the meantime, of course, there's been an increase in as economies have expanded, the amount of freight movement has increased as well. There were some things which we did, which were maybe over-optimistic. Because I remember we did a Delphi survey, I think in 2008, 2009, looking forward to 2020. And we were asking mixed samples of academics, policymakers, managers, what they thought, for example, would be the level of empty running of trucks in the UK in 2020. You may remember that.
Yeah.
And their median answer was it would be reduced from 29% or 27% to 20%, right? If you look at the figures today, it's actually gone up from 27% to 29%. So that's an example. And it wasn't just we were saying this. This was the sort of view of the stakeholders and experts in this area that we consulted at the time. So there are some trends, regrettably, which have gone in the wrong direction, but there are others which I think have gone in the right direction. So it's a bit mixed.
So there's lots of sort of good things that have happened about that. And you mentioned about certain ones, sort of about high capacity vehicles and changing the way that things move through the system so that you could combine loads and join things together. Do you think, I suppose I puzzle over how we get lots of what are important things, but are sort of quite small actions in a sense, compared with a kind of what do we do to dramatically change something? So how do we sort of coordinate these different actions? Which managers are going to do this? Which companies? Do we have leading companies? Will there be leading companies in supply chains who drive all these changes?
Yeah. Again, a great point. I mean, one of the challenges that we have is, take road freight. It's a highly fragmented sector. So in Europe, we've got over 500,000 small truckers, right? So how do you motivate all of them to apply good practice in terms of the environment? Obviously, there are various advisory campaigns we can run to try to do that. But my feeling is that procurement is probably going to influence that. It's because a lot of the work done by small carriers is done on a subcontract basis for bigger logistics providers, for DB Schenker and DHL and so forth. And I think these logistic providers, who themselves have committed to ambitious carbon reduction targets, I think they're declaring themselves net zero. So they will have to use their procurement process to get the small carriers that work for them to help to decarbonize their operation. I think that can, and of course, at the next level up, the shippers, there are lots of big corporations who are heavy users of logistics worldwide that have made these declarations that they're going to be net zero, in some cases long before 2050. I mean, I think IKEA wants to be net zero by 2030, for example. So they will exert pressure on the logistics providers, and they in turn will impact. They in turn will influence and I think that maybe is how it's going to work. And then you mentioned carbon pricing and taxation. I mean, it will be brave governments, it seems to be, that impose high carbon taxes, but it may become necessary. But that has to be combined with regulation, which you also mentioned. I think it'll be a combination of fiscal measures and regulation which will help to drive it.
I think in a moment, Katrin will come back with some of these questions which are appearing in the chat here, but maybe there's a chat and the question and answers, so I'm not quite sure about that. But so, I mean, you had quite a lot of comments and so on from this, but maybe we can just round off with a sort of a couple more questions I have about this. It seems to me that you've been, although it's a bit frustrating what's been happening about this, you actually, as you say, think there's quite a lot of positive things that can be done. So I suppose in the next 5 years, what would you like to see as the sort of, if you could name, say, 3 actions that you would really like to see happen in the next 5 years, which you feel are very important, what would those 3 sort of steps be? What would the 3 things, 2 or 3? I mean, it doesn't matter if it's not 3, but
yes, okay,
in the looking ahead to 2050, what do we need to do now, in that sense, to actually have even a reasonable chance of getting to these targets?
Okay, so beyond that time frame, most of the decarbonisation will occur, in the case of road freight, for example, by the move to low carbon powertrains, to batteries or battery-stroke hydrogen vehicles, right? But that's not going to cut much carbon over the next 5 years, right? Digitalization, it seems to me, has got a critical role to play here. I mean, it was only one bullet point in one slide, but again, that merited a bit more attention, because when we surveyed these 90 logistics executives last year, one message that came back almost unanimously was that digitalization will be transforming the way we manage logistics across all the main freight sectors over the next few years. And thankfully, I mean, that can help us to decarbonize operations. It can help us to improve load factors, improve vehicle routing, and so forth. So digitalization, I think, is one.
It's a key thing. Yeah.
It is. The other thing which I would like to see happen to a greater extent is collaboration in the supply chain. Because I mean, there are lots of case studies to show that where companies work together, they get both an economic and a carbon benefit from doing that, to share their vehicles and so forth. It can also help to build loads and make it easier to shift freight from road to rail. It can make intermodal services more viable.
Yeah.
But you and I have been in this game a long time. You know, there's been discussion on supply chain collaboration going way back to the 1980s. And despite all of that, you know, I often say, supply chain collaboration is still the exception rather than the rule, right? So and again, this is an issue of changing the mindsets of the managers, giving them a sense of the fact that we are in a climate emergency. We have to act quickly. And hopefully that will then translate into a sort of more positive efforts to collaborate and to share assets, I think, as well. The other thing which I'd like to see is an acceleration of the manufactured uptake of the next generation of lower carbon vehicles. Because, I mean, I think I'm right in saying that the average, it takes about 13 years to recycle the European truck fleet.
Right.
So once these new vehicles become available, it'd be quite nice if we could compress that recycling, that process of updating and refreshing the fleet, so that we can get that low carbon technology into the system as quickly as possible.
Yeah. I guess that you know, we're sort of getting to the end of the time that's available for the talk, but and maybe I can just sort of finish with one sort of further area of thought about this. And I guess that my question is not really I don't think that we can't expect people to be very altruistic in this. So somebody, you know, politicians have to be interested in it, politicians have to be motivated. Have you seen some countries which you think are sort of taking the lead? You mentioned in some cases the initiative of sort of like low carbon electricity, which Sweden has obviously, both for natural reasons, but also because of sort of longer term planning and policy decisions. Do you see some sort of signs that some countries could be leaders in this and would benefit from that?
Yeah, well, I mean, yes. I mean, you're based now in a country, I think, which is doing great work. I mean, the fossil-free freight initiative, for example, the work of Closer and others, and you also, as I said, have this advantage of having very low carbon electricity. I think.
But I guess it's how you transfer that elsewhere, isn't it? Because you know, I obviously I'm looked a lot at city logistics, and we still have lots of nice projects, but don't have much scale in some cases. And you get this idea that everything is context specific. So how on earth do you copy and scale this? You know, we seem to be able to copy and scale some quite negative things, but positive things seem harder to copy and scale for some reason.
Yes. Well, of course, unlike Britain, I mean, you're still a member of the EU, and I think the European Commission is very serious about its Green Deal and its sustainable and smart mobility, and hopefully that will result in you know, cross-fertilization of good practice in this area. I mean, the UK government recently published its Decarbonizing Transport document, and one thing that disappointed me was there's no reference to how this is done elsewhere. It's as if somehow Britain is going to invent the way to do this. So I think there is a need for greater collaboration. I mean, one thing I find very reassuring is the Biden policies in the US. I mean, Biden, it seems to me, he's obviously suffered as a result of the Afghanistan situation, but he is very serious about getting America onto the right decarbonization trajectory, and is investing a lot of money in new infrastructure and everything to achieve that. So I think you know, that there are examples of countries that are doing the right thing. I mean, even the UK, as you know, we're very quickly decarbonizing our electricity as well. And particularly where I am here in Scotland, you know, we get strong currents around the country and a lot of winds, obviously. So we could probably follow Sweden in actually decarbonizing our electricity pretty quickly as well.
Yes.
We need, you're right, we need some sort of global networking here so that there's an exchange of best practice, because it's a global problem. I mean, there's no point 1 or 2 countries getting to zero net zero if other countries continue to spew out the stuff. So it's we need a genuine international effort.
Yeah. Okay. And I think Katrin will sort of appear when we're due to actually end the discussion. But one question that I can see here in the side panel is I think would be nice to get your views on. You know, what would it take to convince more industry leaders to be, you know, to take this matter as a sort of something that they would be involved in? I mean, I think you've got examples of where there are many examples of industries that are doing a lot, but what could we do to to support that, I suppose, as well as encourage even more people to do it? Do you think as researchers there are things we could do, or do you think we just have to hope that it's that activists who somehow push this more? Do you think?
What do you think? What is it that changes the mindset of a senior manager? Okay.
Yeah.
Leaving aside their business commitments, they're citizens, they're human beings.
Yeah.
And if they see the news and if they see an increase in the frequency and intensity of extreme weather, and even if that comes closer to home, you know, inevitably that gives them a sense of the scale of the climate crisis that we're in, and hopefully that would, but that needs to be reinforced by other messages. As I said, I feel that carbon pricing, using the price mechanism, you know, where companies have to factor a carbon price into their balance sheet, that will also be a game changer, it seems to me. I mean, there are also international networks that support this process.
Yes.
You know, there's We Mean Business, for example, and Carbon Disclosure Project. So there are these well-established organizations which, I mean, they act to inspire companies to more aggressively cut their CO2 emissions, but also these are networks through which information is exchanged on how to decarbonize. So yeah, so I think there are, and the other thing is the younger generation and the influence that they can now exert on business behavior as well, because that is the future generation of consumers.
Yes.
And their buying behavior, it seems to me, in the future is probably going to be more carbon sensitive than our buying behavior has been. So I think there are a number of things pushing in the right direction.
Yeah. No, and I mean, it's obviously very encouraging when we saw the film, just before you spoke, we saw the film for 10 years of TREFF and initiatives like this. It's very encouraging when you see the number of people who are attending events on these important, you know, on topics like transport efficiency and so on. Of course, it could be more, but now the fact that we record them, that does mean that dissemination of things can be enhanced, I think, which does give more chance for people to get involved. Exactly. And it does seem to me that it's the number of people who are motivated and interested and involved in that sense is increasing. It's just that it's probably increased. It's not increasing fast enough, though, I think, and it's how to speed that up. And as you said, the idea of accelerating things, that's very significant, I think, and something that we could also really focus on, and that there could be more research about this acceleration, I think.
Yes, yes, definitely.
Good. Okay, so I can see Katrin has reappeared in the screen anyway,
yes, and here I am.
And so that's a sign to stop the discussing and hand over to Katrin. So Alan, big thanks for that presentation, and it was fun to see.
Talking to you, Mike.
Fun to see you in Edinburgh, yes. And I did say that you would always get something in about the weather, so you managed it again, even with a slide. So it's great.
But we've been lucky. We've had a really nice summer this year, which is very unusual for Scotland.
Good. Okay.
You can't avoid the weather when you're in Scotland.
That's right. I stop now to myself.
Yes. Thank you so much, Mike, for your interesting questions and your discussion. That's really one thing that you said that struck me was that why we have the pattern of consumption and why we have, well, where we are today is actually because we are very good at logistics. If you look at Logistics Performance Index, Sweden, Germany, top nations in logistics, the competence is there. And that relates to one of the questions that's been coming in the chat. What kind of skills and talents are needed in the logistics system to be able to reach the Paris Agreement? And how do we attract these talents to the logistics field, which is, of course, very relevant for us in academia? Yeah,
that's a very good question. I've recently written a book chapter. It's going to be an MBA text, which will be published next year. What it looks at is the skill requirements for the future generation of logistics and supply chain managers. So what I've done is to say, how will that skill set have to change to equip managers with a knowledge of decarbonization? So all I can do is recommend my chapter in that book. But obviously there's a knowledge at the moment of sustainability and the environmental impact of operations. Then within that area of sustainability, we can drill down and look at what do you have to do to decarbonize. So it spans things like how do you measure your emissions? How do you set meaningful targets for reducing those emissions? It seems to me you have to have some knowledge of the decarbonization options, and that becomes multidisciplinary because you've got to have some knowledge of the engineering aspects, as well as the softer managerial aspects as well. You also have to understand processes like carbon offsetting and what forms of carbon offsetting would be acceptable. So yeah, I mean, there are a lot of things you have to learn, I think, to be a manager equipped to deal with this low carbon future that logistics is going to have over the next few decades.
Or at least have a good managerial team that have these competence. Maybe it's very hard to get in one person, but more as an important function at the companies. Another question was about, well, it's some of what the last year has taught us, the pandemic, it shows the magnitude of required change. And in the beginning here, well, in the first part of this day, we talked a lot about risks and disruptions. So has the corona been, or COVID-19 been a catalysator for realizing the amount of change that is needed and the speed that is needed? That's the first thing.
Yeah. I mentioned the International Transport Forum a few times in my presentation. In May last year, they published a report where they looked at the extent to which CO2 emissions from freight transport had reduced as a result of lockdowns around the world. So I think the maximum lockdown of industry and societies and economies around the world, the amount of CO2 from freight reduced by about 28%, right? Now, that's quite interesting because in an earlier report by the ITF, they had a scenario where emissions from freight would reduce by 30% by 2030, right? So what COVID did was help to reach that 2030 target within about 2 or 3 months. The problem is, of course, that was just temporary because as economies have rebounded, so we've seen CO2 emissions from freight begin to rise again much more sharply. But what it did do was to illustrate to people just how dramatic the changes would have to be for us to get onto the right trajectory, to cut our emissions from freight transport. But you're right, there are other things that companies, I think, have begun to do which will have a carbon benefit. So I sense that there is greater interest in supply chain resilience now than there was before, because companies had their supply chains disrupted by the pandemic. And if that then results in companies perhaps sourcing more products locally, for example, or moving more to nearshoring, that could translate into less freight movement and less CO2. So I think there are some co-benefits, if you like, environmental co-benefits that might come from the way that companies now manage their supply chains after the pandemic.
Yeah, because during the day we've been discussed with the panelists about regionalization, shorten the supply chains, source more close to your market, etc. Is that something you have seen? And also in hand with that, you could say that the risk of climate change to secure your business also when it comes to climate change, could that go hand in hand, and have you sensed that among business leaders?
Yeah, I mean, I've picked it up from the small number of managers that I deal with directly, but Ernst & Young did 2 surveys last year. They did a survey, I think, in April last year, where they asked companies how they might be altering their supply chains as a result of their COVID experience. And I think at that stage, about 80% of them said that they would be reshoring more of their production. But when they redid the survey 6 months later in October, that figure had dropped to about 30%, right? So, I think there was an immediate reaction to COVID, and then on reflection, companies decided it wouldn't necessarily impact on their supply chains to quite the same extent.
And what have been the answer today? I mean, this spring has been very tough for a lot of global deliveries and for companies.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if Ernst & Young have done another survey to see if that downward trend has continued. I don't think so. I mean, but just picking up, reading things from the business press, for example, I think there is a feeling that companies really now should reevaluate the risks to their supply chains, not just from pandemics, but also the climate risk. Because as I said earlier, if we're getting incidents, more frequent and intense incidents of extreme weather, that then companies may want to relocalize production to minimize the risk. But the other point I must make here is that a lot of international trade actually helps to cut CO2 emissions. That very often that you find the carbon footprint of the imported product is lower than the carbon footprint of the domestically produced product. Right? So we should be producing things in those parts of the world where the production-related emissions are minimized, even if that means we've got to move them long distances. So I don't buy into the argument of some of the environmentalists that we should just relocalize everything. That actually would not minimize CO2 emissions. We have to accept that a lot of trade, I mean, somebody put a figure on it saying about 40% of international trade actually helps to cut carbon emissions.
That's a very good point. Thank you so much, Alan. Could I ask a very quick last question, if you have a quick answer? Because I'm so curious. What are your expectations of the COP26 in Glasgow?
Right. I suppose I have to be diplomatic and polite and say I think it's going to be a great success. but I'm giving you an idea of my political views here. I do not have great confidence in the UK government or in Boris Johnson, and my fear is that it may not go well. I mean, this is the critical COP. You know, this is the one that really has to work and get great international agreement. And I'm just hoping that it actually works, but not because it's in Scotland or anything, but I just think that I'm not sure that the UK government is properly prepared at the present for to achieve that level of international agreement.
It is an important event. Let's hope and see. Yes, exactly. Thank you so much, Alan. Thank you so much, Mike.
Great. It's been my pleasure. Bye-bye.
So,